JJ. All right, it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk with you about, first, before the break, about how to reduce methane emissions, and then after the break go on nitrogen and phosphorus excretions and how to reduce those. And I give a lot of talks on methane, and I always start with this picture, which comes back to what Brian and Koen already said. What's the role of dairy cattle in our society? One of those major roles is obviously to upcycle high fiber ingredients, feed ingredients that we humans can't use, and make that into nutritious milk and in the end meat. And you don't get something for nothing, huh? So that greenhouse gas methane is unavoidably formed within that process. So, this is a slide that shows that as an Earth, as the world, as humans, we are well beyond 6 of the 9 boundaries that our planet can have. On the top you see that climate change, right? So that's the first part before the break of my talk, the methane being greenhouse gas emission. And you see other things there like land system change or the biochemical flows, and that have a lot to do with nitrogen and phosphorus excess in our environment, and that's after the break. Okay, and I will be talking about the major greenhouse gas, which is methane, but there are other greenhouse gases, obviously. So I'll do briefly give some background on methane and the process of methanogenesis, then look at what are the most promising strategies, dietary strategies to reduce methane. And if there's time, I'm not sure how we're doing, but time, I'll go on with quantitative approaches. Okay. The challenge methane and its impact on warming of the Earth, and you all know the global warming potential. The global warming potential of methane depends on the time scale you look at. On a 20 years time scale, it's 81 more powerful than carbon dioxide. On a 100-year time scale, it's used the most, it's 27, all right? But there are issues with how we express this. I saw this global warming potential in the previous presentation as well, but already Brian mentioned also the GEP star. So what's happening? If you look at the major greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide from fossil fuel, right? And carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what we emit now will stay there in the atmosphere, okay? Will form, like, if you like, a blanket over there, keeping on warming the Earth. The blanket gets thicker and thicker. What we emit today will have an impact for hundreds of years, all right? And methane is very different. Methane has a lifetime of only 12 years in the atmosphere on average. And that means what we emit now, after some time, 12 years on average, is gone. Okay, you see, if we might reduce methane to such a level that it's equal to its disappearance rate from the atmosphere, there's no thickening of this blanket, if you like, and there's no further warming of the Earth in that respect. Okay, and that's why we have to look at methane in a different way than carbon dioxide or the other greenhouse gases, and that's a major challenge if you look at the LCAs that Koen and Brian were just presenting and how we express the impact of methane. Are we doing a good job? Well, in Europe, no. Hardly anything decreased in terms of methane. We do decrease methane from the fossil fuel industry, from livestock in the EU, not worldwide. Methane is only increasing. So we really have to step up it a bit. Okay. So our target for carbon dioxide, the target is to go back to 0 emissions. For methane, if we want to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario of IPCC, for methane we need to go back to, say, 30% reduction in 2030, up to 50% reduction in 2050. That's sufficient. Okay? So that's our target. Now, I was involved in a large meta-analysis that was published in 2022, made quite some impact, in which we look at all the different strategies to reduce methane. I'll come back to that later. And the good news is, suppose that Europe would adapt one of the strategies that we advised here, we could achieve that target for 2030. And if Europe would, all the farmers, dairy farmers, would adopt 2 strategies together, we could achieve that target in 2050. That's great. For other areas of the world, for example, Africa, no way. Why? Because of this increase in demand of consumers for animal products will totally offset any decrease in methane possible by strategies. Okay? So I think as a rich Europe or rich America or wherever you're from, we need to step it up a bit more than in other parts of the world. And I will deal with how to do that. Okay, and there are lots of pledges and initiatives from countries and from companies, and they're all great and nice initiatives, but the bottom line is how to get there. What can you do? What can you really do at the farm level? Okay, and that's what I'm going to look at with you. So the principle of methane, I guess you all know this, rumen fermentation, this degradation, fermentation of feed. In the process, hydrogen is formed, and the classical view is that hydrogen has to be removed, otherwise fermentation process will be less efficient, and the removal is by forming methane. All right? So if we look at how to decrease that methane emissions, this is the principle. The plant material goes to hexose, volatile fatty acids being formed in the rumen. The nice thing there, or an interesting thing already there, is the type of volatile fatty acid formed, determines how much hydrogen is becoming available, and therefore how much methane is becoming produced. But if you look at the targets, what you can do is decrease hydrogen production, okay? Have alternative hydrogen sinks, let it not go to methane, or accept that hydrogen is going up by inhibiting methanogens directly and simply accept hydrogen will be larger, right? Those are the targets, and I will deal with those targets and nutritional strategies in all kinds of methane mitigation strategies. And I'll start with the general nutritional strategies, and then I'll give some pointers as to specific additives to reduce methane. Okay. But first, the downside again. This is again from that ARNT meta-analysis, and we analyzed many strategies, and it depends on how you express it. But by and large, in our meta-analysis, 2/3 of all the strategies that you can see in literature don't work. They're not effective. They don't give a significant impact on reduction of methane. Not good, but that's what it is. Around 20% gives methane reductions greater than 10%. It's sizable, right? However, you can also reduce methane, for example, by having, say, a lower digestibility. Less digestible material, less methane formation. You don't want that, right? So only a few of those 20% strategies were actually effective. And I'm going to look with you what are effective strategies. But keep this in mind when you read scientific literature, papers, whatever, be critical. A lot of the strategies don't work, and we need very good, solid science to go to true solutions. Okay. One of the solutions that we identified is to decrease the grass maturity. Grass, obviously, a major part of the diet of ruminants. Okay. Why does it work? Because it shifts rumen fermentation towards more propionic acid, less acetic acid, and it increases production that Brian was already addressing also. Greater production means less feed per unit of milk or meat, and therefore less methane. All right, so that's the mode of action, if you like. What we found was nice reduction in methane emissions. The different ways to express that in absolute terms, per unit feed, per unit product, right? But nice reductions in methane emissions. And I will look into one more specific experiment into detail, so to get a good understanding of what's happening in this nice way of reducing methane. We did an experiment in which we made different qualities of grass silage, so had this very leafy grass silage up to a grass silage harvested of grass of an older stage, very stemmy, more difficult to degrade. And you can see there the fiber content, as expected, increases of those silages. The net energy content obviously decreases with a lower digestibility, okay? And that's expressed there in the organic matter digestibility as well as the fat and protein corrected milk. Now for this experiment, the Animal Experimental Committee demanded from us that we were not giving this very high quality grass silage alone. Our Animal Experimental Committee thought that would be bad for the animals. We disagreed, but they are in power. So we had to add straw there, 5% straw, so it's not a complete good evaluation. And we kept the feed intake the same, but you might expect that the more younger grass silage would have a greater feed intake, okay? Okay, so we express methane in absolute terms. Only the lowest one, the leafy grass silage, had a lower methane emission, and the rest didn't differ that much. But if you express methane per unit of feed, then the first difference start to pop up. More methane for that more mature grass silage. If you express it per unit of digestible organic matter, that's the important one, what a cow really needs, the nutrients that are digested. That's what she can produce milk from. So that's a good way to express methane. Methane per unit of digestible organic matter clearly differed a lot. 30% more on this mature grass silage compared to the young leafy grass silage. And then finally, per unit of product, the same picture, a greater amount of methane when you have that more mature grass silage. So it depends on which metrics, which units you take to decide and to see how methane will change, right? That's important. But it's also, it shows here that a farmer, weather allowing, etc., all kinds of conditions, but there are management options in order to reduce methane emissions. Or the other way around, if you do life cycle analysis, or if you look at how is my farm doing in terms of methane, you need to take into account this type of variation. And I see a lot of LCAs in which you simplify things and you get one value for grass or grass silage, and it's not true. And it's important to take that variation into account. Okay, these are all the studies I could find on grass or grass silage in which the scientists try to change the quality of that grass or grass silage by maturity. On the horizontal axis expressed it as NDF, as the quality of grass silage, vertical axis methane per unit of digestible organic matter. And by and large, you see the same picture. Greater NDF in the grass silage or the grass herbage the cows graze, more methane. All right, and I'll come back if we have time how to quantify this in the last part of the talk. Okay. Trade-offs, that you don't get something for nothing. Some of the trade-offs for the Netherlands, very important, is that that younger grass silage or fresh grass herbage usually has a higher protein content, more nitrogen, and that's a big issue in the Netherlands. It's one of the possible trade-offs. And the other one is that it's simply a more intense management that may decrease the total grass production from your hectares of fields in a year's time. Okay, maize silage, other way around. So farmers in the Netherlands, for example, they can harvest maize silage at different stages of maturity. I expressed it here as the dry matter content. All right, harvesting at the young stage, lower dry matter content, means more methane, either per unit of feed or per unit of milk. So for maize silage, all the way around as grass or grass silage. All right? And if we do the same thing, but now we swap grass silage and maize silage, it's better to use maize silage if you want to reduce methane emissions. There may be all kinds of things why you don't want to use maize silage, but if you've got the opportunity, this is again one of those practical management things that people can use to decrease methane emissions. All right? Okay, what's another option? That's the inclusion of tanniferous forages. Tannins are plant secondary compounds, as you know, I guess, rich in phenols, as depicted over there. All right, and those phenols, they have an impact. They kind of inhibit the rumen methanogens, the microorganisms that produce methane. You also reduce protozoa, and a large number of methanogens actually are closely connected to protozoa. So it makes sense that if we reduce protozoa, also reduce methanogens, and they may shift rumen fermentation towards more propionic acid. So that's the mode of action of tannins, or tanniferous forages. Again, in our meta-analysis, we found some nice reductions in methane, depending on how you express it again. Okay? They're very promising species that, especially in the tropical and subtropical areas that Brian was talking about, all those areas where there's a lot of methane being formed, these are the practical issues or strategies that you can take by having more tannin-rich forages. But you can also buy, obviously, commercial tannin extracts from acacia or whatever there is. Okay? There are trade-offs again. At higher levels, animals tend not to like it, so lower dry matter intakes, no good. You can use only a limited amount. They may decrease protein and fiber digestibility. Actually, for protein, for the Netherlands at least, this is an interesting topic because you make a change in the partitioning of the nitrogen away from the urine to the feces. And the urine nitrogen is far more susceptible to losses in the form of ammonia or nitrous oxide or whatever than feces. And actually, to be honest, I see in the Netherlands, or at least in Western Europe, I see more possibilities to use tannins to address the nitrogen problem than to address the methane problem. But it's definitely a good option if you are in areas where you rely a lot on roughage and where you don't have many other options. Oils and fats, very good way to reduce methane. Why? It's simply high in energy that is not fermented in the rumen. You don't get methane from it, and it still delivers energy to the animal. And usually it also shifts rumen fermentation somewhat to more propionic acid. So in that way, it reduces methane. Nice absolute reduction in methane, depending again on how you express it, and whether you look at daily gain for a beef animal or milk production of a dairy cow. All right. This is from the overview that we presented. There are, again, obviously, trade-offs. Obviously, as you all know, you can't use too much fat in a ruminant diet because of the negative impact of rumen fermentation if there's too much. In our meta-analysis, we also analyzed the impact on production. Too much of that fat may decrease the weight gain of animals. And what's really important, and then we come back to those LCA analysis, making those oils, extracting the oils, whatever, requires a lot of energy. And if you look at the LCAs, there's a lot of upstream greenhouse gas emissions associated with getting the product in the first place. So part of your methane reduction is offset by greater upstream greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, let's look at some of the additives that you can have. One of the additives is nitrate, or the commercial name Silver from Cargill. What it does, it simply is an alternative sink for hydrogen, which you can see here. So it takes up the hydrogen, makes it into ammonia, and that ammonia can be used by the rumen microbes to make macrobial protein. And this is energetically favorable. So this reaction will happen in favor of the traditional methanogenesis. Great way to get rid of surplus hydrogen, reducing methane. All right? It's dose dependent. The more nitrate you give, the greater is the reduction in methane. Like 1% nitrate, as a rule of thumb, gives 8% less methane, 2% nitrate, 16% less methane, okay? In that way, it works. There are trade-offs again. It adds nitrogen, so you need to get rid of some other nitrogen sources in the diet. If unadapted, this is a major element. If animals are unadapted and you go to, say, above 1%, there's the risk of methemoglobinemia. All right, so you need to be careful in adapting animals if you go to the higher levels. And at the same time, if you really go to high levels, 1.5%, 2% or more, feed intake may be reduced. In the Netherlands, this is an acceptable solution, up to, say, 1%, and that's also in our kringloopwijzer, our annual nutrient cycle assessment. It's one of the options that you can take, and it's in there. Okay. Another option, essential oil blends. Essential oils are volatile aromatic compounds. derived from certain herbs or spices, like garlic, allicin from garlic. And what they do, the mode of action, they bind to protein and they shift rumen fermentation. So in that way, they can help to reduce methane. Very, very promising results in the lab. Very promising results in vitro. There's this meta-analysis on a particular product that was researched the most, echolin. Methane yield reduction of 13%. Nice reduction by using this product. And what they found was that the effect appeared to be more pronounced in long-term studies. In studies only lasting 4 weeks, a reduction of 2%. In long-term studies, reductions of 13%. Quite a difference, right? What's the problem? In that meta-analysis, the majority of the studies were in vitro, not in the animal itself. Or, and this is for me as a scientist a real problem, were not published. And then I don't know what's the quality of that research. How was that research performed? How did they measure methane? If you don't have the details, I can't be sure of how it was done. I don't want to be critical, but I do think we need solid science. All right? So, I looked at all the experiments after this meta-analysis on what they found on echolin. Yes, in real animals, right? Measured for 10 weeks. All 3 were in 10 weeks periods. Only one of them had a significant effect of echolin, and none of them had any indication that the effect would be stronger after some time. So apparently, the true research shows, unfortunately, there is no impact of echolin that becomes stronger in time. And again, we need solid science to have that. Okay, some trade-offs. It may decrease the growth rate. However, there are also indications it may somewhat increase milk production, and if milk production is increased, obviously, methane per unit of milk will decrease. Okay, next one, 3-nitrooxypropanol, or Bovaer from DSM. How does it work? It's a structural analog from methyl coenzyme M, and methyl coenzyme M is one of those cofactors that is very important in the very last step of methanogenesis that all the archaea do in whatever anaerobic system they are. It's about methyl coenzyme M reductase, and if this 3-NOP is binding to this MCR enzyme, the enzyme is changed in its 3-dimensional shape and it's not active anymore. Okay? Very nice principle that DSM made from starting from the basics, what's the 3D structure, what are the most limiting enzymes in there, and then they came up with in vitro studies up to the way to in vivo studies. Major effects, but highly variable. Okay, as you can see here. Variation from no effect, no significant effect, up to 84% reduction. And if we've got time, at the last part I will go back into quantification. But we have to realize it depends on the diet fat. We did an experiment in which we had 3-NOP at 2 different levels, 60 or 80 ppm. And we fed that to cattle receiving a high grass silage diet or diets in which we replace part of the grass silage with corn silage or maize silage. Okay? So from green grass silage up to blue, more maize silage. This is the reduction in methane compared with the control. Okay? So as you would expect, giving more 3-NOP from 60 to 80, you see those bars are deeper, a greater reduction in methane. But you can also see that reduction in methane depends a lot on the basal diet fat. Okay? So the efficacy of 3-NOP is lower if the diet contains more grass silage, more fiber-rich diets. Those are the type of diets that 3-NOP is less effective. All right? That's what this picture here shows. And this is then for hydrogen, but I skipped that for the moment. It's just that hydrogen went up quite a bit, but without apparently any negative effect for the animal. Okay. So what's the target dose? It has been approved in Europe by EFSA, and the target dose is between 60 to 90 milligram per kilogram. And like I said, depending on the basal diet, you're looking at somewhere between 20 to 40% less methane per unit of feed or per unit of milk. So quite a good reduction in methane possible here. Possible trade-offs: if you give too much, there may be a decrease in feed intake and therefore performance. So the advice generally is to stick to, say, 60 ppm and accept somewhere between 20 and 30% reduction. All right? Seaweeds. I guess most of you have learned about seaweeds and how seaweeds can change methane emissions. So we have to distinguish the seaweeds, the red and the blue and the green, the brown and the green, seaweeds into how they work. We've got non-halogenated seaweeds and we've got halogenated seaweeds with active compounds like bromoform. First, the non-halogenated ones with fluorotannins, a compound similar to tannins or saponins or alkaloids. Again, very promising results on methane mitigation in the lab, in vitro. However, all the cattle experiments that I saw were negative. They did not show an effect of those seaweeds on a decrease in methane. Again, it shows there's a difference between our in vitro results and the actual results in the animal. In vitro is great to look at how the mechanism might be and to do a first screening or whatever, but you always have to test it in the real animal itself using proper methane measurement strategies. They may have, though, some health benefits, and if they have a health benefit indirectly, they may decrease methane per unit of product formed, right? Simply by having healthier animals. Major limitation is also that they contain inorganic elements, heavy metals like iodine or arsenic or whatever there is, okay, which limits their use in practice. Okay, let's look at the halogenated compounds. The red seaweed, Asparagopsis. The active compound in there is bromoform, although these days there are also indications that it's at least a major part of the effect is from dibromochloramethane. It's a derivative of that bromoform. Major effects in cattle, up to 99% have been measured in the real animal experiments. All methane wiped out. And that's the headlines in newspapers that you will see then, right? Great, no methane anymore. Large variation also. It's a dose-dependent effect. The more bromoform there is in this Asparagopsis, the greater is the impact on methane. However, if there's more methane inhibition, results also show there's more impact on the performance of the animals. And I'll show that here in this slide. So here I've got the 6 experiments to date that have looked at Asparagopsis in dairy cattle. Okay? And you see from those orange bars, that's the treatments with Asparagopsis compared to the green bar, the control, there's a very nice reduction in methane emissions, right? But there's a clear impact on feed intake and on milk production. And if you look at the numbers, the greater reduction in methane, the greater is the possible impact on milk production and feed intake. Okay, so if you look at levels from, say, 30% or so reduction of methane, above that, you will see, from those 6 experiments, you will see negative impact on feed intake and milk production. Something to take into account, right? What are other negative effects apart from it that it may decrease performance in dairy cattle? Actually may increase feed efficiency in beef cattle, I have to say. So the situation is different for dairy and beef cattle. Bromoform is not a nice compound. It's a possible human or animal carcinogen. In principle, you don't like to feed it to your animals. It contributes to ozone depletion. So that was the reason that 2 decades ago or so, those compounds were banned in the use of refrigerator fluid. Is it good for us to reintroduce, growing seaweeds with the possible extra bromoform emissions to the environment? There may be rumen wall damage. There's data from sheep, and we did it with cattle, and the pictures are from our experiments. We found, and also in sheep, after some time that the rumen wall shows inflammations. And it may be that this bromoform is having a negative impact on rumen wall integrity. All right, we're not sure about that, but there are more and more indications that it may not be good for the health of the animal. And it will have undecided product changes like increased iodine content or increased bromine content. In this experiment of the Scandinavian people, Christian, they calculated that a child of 5 years or 6 years of age could drink only half a cup of milk of this bromoform Aspergillus treated cows before they would reach the allowed levels of iodine. Okay, there goes our selling point for dairy as being very nutritious and healthy. So it's a major element of interest. I'm not saying that we should not use seaweed. I want to be sure that we know about possible negative impacts. What's happening these days is that pharmaceutical products are being developed like oil-immersed bromoform derived from seaweed, and there are other developments over there to have it in a more pure state and have less negative effects. Okay, just some reflection from me on specifically on those anti-methanogenic feed additives. So first of all, there are some great strategies, and that's great, and we should probably use those as our license to produce for dairy. Now, those methane inhibitors usually do not improve animal performance, and that means, and Brian was talking about it as well, and Koen, we need somehow incentives in order to get it happen, right? We need some policies, some incentives to do it. There are issues about consumer acceptance. We may have it fully declared safe by authorities like EFSA, and still we see that, the consumers may doubt the safety of the product, or whether it matches the natural production of dairy cattle, or whatever there is. It's something to take into account. Unfortunately, most of those additives have been tested in confined systems. And a lot of animals obviously are in mixed systems or grazing. And if you use like 3-NO-P, 3-NO-P is very rapidly metabolized in rumen. In 2-3 hours, it's gone. So how to do it with a grazing animal that's perhaps twice a day at milking, may eat concentrate with 3-NO-P in it, all right? Or those beef cattle that you have there in the field and you don't see in weeks, basically. How do they get those additives? So we need to look for, and that's a development, slow release ways of having those inhibitors being delivered in the rumen. And what's really lacking, there's virtually no data on combination of strategies. One strategy is usually not enough to reach our target in 2050. We need two or more strategies together. And we don't know if they are equally effective or if they're boosting each other or, right? Only very few experiments on that. And we really need more experiments to know what's happening in combinations of feed additives. Okay. JJ, do we still have time?
Sure do. Go ahead.
All right, good. So we need to know how much methane does a cow produce and what's the impact of any strategy we take. It makes quite a difference if that impact is 10% reduction or 20% reduction. Right, so we need quantitative approaches. And quantitative approaches basically are models. And I like models a lot. This is my background. I keep it simple. So we have empirical models, mechanistic models, it's depicted over there. Empirical models simply use data directly, and they try to get the best relationship, and you don't necessarily look at any biological mechanism that may be involved over there. Mechanistic models, they do seek to understand cause-effect relationships, right? We try to understand what's happening. We describe the system in terms of its lower components. All right? I'll start with the empirical models because they are at present the most practical, usually, to apply. So what I'll do, I'll show, there are many prediction equations to predict methane emissions from cattle. For example, national inventories often use IPCC equations that will inform you how much methane animals in certain situations will emit. Okay. What I'll show you is some results of this global network project, and I will deal with dairy cattle data on how you can quantify it and what are the most important elements in quantifying methane emissions. So what we did in this large collaborative project was to take individual cow observations measured in a proper way, good way with respiration chambers or the green feed from all over the world. And we also looked at the additional data that we could have on intake, on animal characteristics and so on, to try and obtain good relationships and good prediction models, okay? And then we do something like linear mixed models. That's not a big deal for today. It's just that we try to include all the factors like the body weight of the animal or the feed intake or the fiber content of the diet or whatever, and statistically look at what's the best model and what's a good way of predicting. Okay, what I'll show here on all those plots are observations versus residuals, and that plot visually gives an indication how well those models perform. And in terms of numbers, I express it as the mean absolute error, or the RSR. That's the ratio of the root mean square prediction relative to the error of the standard deviation of the observations. No need to really know what they are. Just remember they should be as low as possible, both. Okay? Now, dry matter intake, not unexpectedly, but all our models, whatever we do, dry matter intake, the feed intake, is the most important driver to explain methane emissions. That's that plot with that red box around it. Just feed intake alone would give to these results. If we add some information in our best model, some information on dietary characteristics, which we know have an impact on methane emissions, and in this case, fiber and ether extract, the lipid content of the diet, were entering our best model, all right? Still, it doesn't improve much. It's hardly any improvement. It's simply feed intake that is determining methane emissions, right? So you need to know feed intake. If we do all the characteristics that we had, the best model we had included fiber, ether extract, the milk fat content, and the body weight of the animal. Some improvement to only feed intake, not a whole lot. Feed intake is simply driving it. Okay? If you don't have feed intake, that's the green bar over there, our best model was far, far worse if we only have the fiber content and the ether extract content. A far worse prediction. And if we did our very best model without feed intake, so that model includes fiber, ether extracts, the milk production, the milk contents, and the body weight, all right, still we're not as good as just feed intake. We need to have feed intake, all right? What's also important is to realize that you can build models, but that model is not necessarily valid in each situation. You have to realize we need to make models specifically for each specific situation. This is an example. If we made all our models and all the data from the global scale that we had, you get this relationship. I related to the gross energy intake, so this follows the IPCC principles on how to calculate methane emissions and put it into national inventories. This is our relationship. However, what's important is that relationship, and especially that slope, depends on where you are in the world, right? Different for Europe than for the United States. Makes sense, because by and large, those US diets have greater levels of concentrate in them, greater levels of starch in them, lower levels of grazing. Message here is, use models that are specific for your situation. Or the other way around, don't use models that have been derived in an empirical way that are not valid for your situation. Okay? Methane is a fraction of gross energy, so IPCC, that's the green one, uses standard 6.5% of the gross energy goes to methane. Not a good prediction in our data set. These days, and we couldn't evaluate it because it came out after we did this analysis, but nowadays IPCC recommends a more variable YM factor, so a more variable fraction of that gross energy that goes to methane. We could not evaluate it, but it's probably doing better. Okay, just to reiterate the importance of feed intake. We looked at the feed intake. Feed intake is not available farm, so what to do if you don't have feed intake? We looked at the equations to estimate the feed intake and took IPCC Tier 2 recommendations how to calculate feed intake in your situation, given the quality of the diet and given the milk production level of the animal. IPCC has calculation rules for that, which are used globally for national inventories. All right? And we applied it to our Wageningen respiration chamber, in which obviously we knew feed intake and we knew the actual methane emissions. So we applied that regional model. We need to use regional models. In the Netherlands is the EU, so we use the European model, okay, with the observed trimeter intake. Pretty good relationship, not too bad. So pretty good prediction. However, if we then use the IPCC predicted feed intake, far, far worse. All right? Not the observed, but the predicted feed intake. And if we then go one step further and we take this variable YM fraction between 5.7 to 6.5% of gross energy, situation gets worse. All right? It's a challenge to predict methane in the proper way. But you get the most close to it if you know feed intake, challenge on farm, but if you can estimate it the best you can and use specific factors for your situation. Okay, you can also do prediction equations for individual feeds. This is the diagram I showed you before, right? The relationship between the quality of the silage and the methane emissions. Well, what you can do here is also, again, run a statistical model, a mixed model to take into account the different effects of the experiments. And this is then the best, or the model we can come up with. So here it says there's a very clear relationship with the fiber content of the diet. And for every 100 grams of more fiber in the diet, we have 4.5 grams methane more per unit of digestible organic matter. That's around 15% of the mean. All right? If you like, you can use these types of relationships in your evaluations on farm or your national inventories, etc. We use this type of equation, for example, in the Dutch Kringloopwijzer, the annual nutrient cycle assessment. All right? Take into account the variation there is in grass herbage or grass silage. Okay, so just as a recap so far, feed intake central to predict methane prediction, use specific equations, and there are equations, I've shown one, but there are more for individual feed ingredients to help to evaluate feed variation. Okay. I'd like to also show an example of how to do that with feed additives, how to quantify feed additives and know or predict what will happen in practice. For that we use meta-analysis. Meta-analysis are systematic ways to aggregate all the data there are, to enhance statistical power, to identify patterns and trends, and to reduce bias and conflicts. Well, I won't deal with those details today. I will show one example, no, I'll show two examples, sorry. The first one is on nitrate supplementation. We took all the data on nitrate supplementation overall, with all that nitrate, yes, there was an effect of 14% reduction compared to the control. Now, in statistical terms, we call this heterogeneity. There's a large heterogeneity. That means that a lot of the variation is not random, but is somehow related to the experiments themselves. And then we're going to look at, okay, what differs in those experiments? That may be, for example, the level of feed intake differs between experiments, or the level of starch differs between experiments, etc. All right? And when we do that, the best model we came up with was to make a difference between dairy cattle and beef cattle. All right? And it included the dose of nitrate and the feed intake. And then you get those type of values that you can utilize in LCA analysis or in order to predict methane in other analysis. So dairy cattle, the basal value is a greater reduction in nitrate than beef cattle. However, this is leveled off by the nitrate dose and the fiber intake. So that nitrate dose means that for every 10 grams more of nitrate, 1% more nitrate, the effect on methane is 9 percentage units greater. Right? That's what that slope value tells you. Or the other way around, if feed intake is greater, is higher, then the mitigating effect of nitrate is less. Meaning, at higher feed intake levels, the same level of nitrate gives somewhat less methane reduction. Makes sense because greater feed intake generally leads to greater passage rates, right? So that nitrate has a higher chance of being passed out of the rumen without being metabolized and doing its effect. This is a type of equation you can use. Okay, you can use it in greenhouse gas accounting tools. We use it in the accounting tool in the Netherlands. The second example, 3-nitrooxypropanol. Again, same system. Overall effect size of all the experiments we could find with dairy cattle, 32%. High heterogeneity, so there must be something underlying it explaining variation. In our best model, we came up with the dose of 3-NOP, level of fiber, and the level of fat. Okay, so what does it tell again? It's dose dependent. The more you give, the greater reduction. But it's less effective when you have higher fiber contents. That's also the result of that experiment that I showed earlier in the presentation. All right? And it's less efficient when the fat content of the diet is higher. Now, potentially, I already said that if a diet has more fat, methane will be lower. There may be the clash here, if you would use fat to get a 3-NOP. We don't know. There are no real experiments on that. There's a first experiment now in Denmark. I can't remember the results really. But that's the type of experiment we need to do. How do different strategies, how can they combine with each other? All right, but these type of equations, again, are utilized in practice. And although they look complex, it's in the end, in Excel, a simple equation that you can use. Okay, so meta-analyses are very powerful in trying to estimate the impact of an anti-methanogenic feed additive on the methane and use it in accounting tools. All right. Because of time, I'm skipping mechanistic models. They're great and they do a good job and they are the future. But I'd like to give a summary, take-home message if you like. So I'm hoping that you realize from my talk that feed intake is central in order, if you want to predict methane emissions. We need to integrate knowledge to help understand response. We need good science to do that. And if you do LCA analysis or if you do anything on farm, change in the diet, realize that consequences are there on methane and you need proper models in order to quantify it. All right? So with that, there are no or limited effectiveness of methane mitigation strategies, unfortunately, although there are quite a few that have high potential. You do require somehow that the good policies of the dairy factories or the government or whatever, and we need to quantify its variation based on solid scientific evidence. And with that, I think I'll stop here until we probably go to the milk break.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Jan.